Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The 20th Shangri-La Dialogue has kicked off in Singapore, bringing together defense ministers and security officials amid the Ukraine crisis, China-U.S. tensions, and other global challenges. How may this event help address key security issues? How does the China-U.S. relationship evolve that help shape the global order? And how will a multipolar world look like? To find out, I'm joined today by George Yeo, former Foreign Minister of Singapore. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue, Mr. Yang. Well, the Chinese side has rejected an overture from the U.S. for a meeting between the two defense ministers. Of course, the U.S. side basically blamed China on the so-called lack of willingness to engage. But then people would say, because of the existing sanctions on the Chinese defense minister, it is very difficult for China to open dialogue with the U.S. side. What do you make of that?
I think there's an element of cultural misunderstanding. For the Chinese people to invite me to talk to you when you sanction me is very rude, 没有礼貌. And I don't think it's acceptable to Chinese people. If you're inviting me for a conversation, you cannot treat me in this way. I'm not sure if on the US side, there's the same cultural perspective. They think these are just tactics. We should still talk. I think both sides should talk. And both sides probably want to talk. But this, I think misunderstanding has to be cleared up. And it requires the US to understand that it's not possible for the Chinese Defense Ministry to agree to talks when he's being sanctioned.
More like cultural differences here. And okay, we are having this Shangri-La dialogue on security issues regionally and globally. I wonder, what's your expectation? Will this meeting in any way help address or communicate from different sides to say to bring about probably more peace and stability?
I don't think the dialogue by itself will improve or harm the state of the world. It's a platform for people to communicate, to understand each other better, to sense each other as individuals, as players on an important chessboard. So the dialogue by itself is not that important. What's important are the conversations, the policy considerations that result from interactions during and around the dialogue.
During and around the dialogue. And of course, one of the, people would say probably the major focus of the meeting will be China-U.S. relationship. As a distinguished former foreign minister of Singapore, you have observed this bilateral relationship between China and the U.S. closely over the years. I wonder, how do you describe, how do you characterize the current dynamics between the two countries? Recently we have seen the U.S. Senior officials, one after the other, basically expressing the willingness to talk to the Chinese side to help stabilize the relationship. But then the question is like, what's their offer? What's on the table? Because there are, for example, around 1,000 Chinese companies are under sanctions, and the U.S. is imposing bans or limits on export for technologies to the Chinese side.
So this is a little game going on. In the short term, I think the U.S. wants relations to improve, not in a big way, but just to stabilize the overall environment. And the reason is partly the Ukraine war, which is absorbing a lot of nervous energy in the West. Partly it's a concern that the economy may not do well, and if we disturb it too much, we may cause something bad to happen. Or if something bad happens, we better have communication channels to coordinate fiscal and monetary policy. Now, in 2008, global financial crisis, the G7 countries were not able on their own to maintain sufficient global demand. So George Bush convened the first G20 summit. In the following year in London, UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown convened the second G20 summit, during which China committed to help. And in 3 years, China poured more concrete than the US in its entire history. Now, China got no gratitude for it. Of course, China did it partly for itself, but it created enormous distortions. When the next financial crisis comes along, I think China will be more calibrated in its response. And when the next financial crisis comes along, there is no functioning G20 because of the refusal of G7 leaders to sit on the same table with Russia. So we may have a big problem here that the world cannot coordinate an appropriate response to a global financial crisis the next time it happens.
Mm-hmm. Closely related to that, of course, is recently the G7 summit in Japan, and seems there's a somewhat new policy from the West toward China. That is, they are going to seek a de-risking policy rather than decoupling. People will be wondering basically what's the difference between de-risking and decoupling, and in particular when countries implement such a policy. Are there any clear rules they are going to follow, or what kind of relationship they are going to pursue with Beijing?
I think it's not just semantics. De-risking suggests that the Western countries and Japan do not want a Cold War. But at the same time, they are very worried that China continues to grow as a comprehensive power, and they feel threatened that the old world they are used to will no longer be in the coming years. So each seeks more ballast. So the Western countries hoping that the G7 can give them more collective ballast. Japan facing a China which is growing bigger and bigger, much bigger than it is, feels that it also needs ballast by being linked to the West. Australia feels the same way, India feels the same way. So there is a certain rebalancing of the world as a result of China's continuing growth. And during the entire 3 years of COVID, China was the least damaged economy in the world and continued to grow and continued to make progress. And this is a challenge to many countries. And in a sense, it's not surprising that they are all reacting in this way.
Okay, if this is the challenge, China as the second largest economy, or the largest, depending on the different measures, different standards. If there's something, say, hiccup of the Chinese economy or Chinese economy economic slowdown, obviously the global economy will suffer. Probably the same you can say for sure with the U.S. economy. So what's the expectation? Do they expect the Chinese economy to slow down, or do they expect the Chinese economy remains healthy?
Well, I think they are torn. On the one hand, they want the growth, and this year China will account for more than a third of global growth, and China next year is likely to grow faster. They want the growth, but they do not want this growth to add to China's strength, because they are bothered by China's strength, relative strength. And this accounts for the tension that all of them feel, and the contradictions that we see in their policies.
Yeah, contradictions. Of course, probably sometimes the change of policies could have consequences in terms of relationship. One of them probably the Taiwan question, for example. China and the U.S. probably the number one thorny issue between the two countries, in particular recently, such as the provocative visit by Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House, to Taiwan, and that the Chinese side obviously responded strongly with some military exercise. Where are we now? Now we are hearing the U.S. side insisting they are not changing this one China principle. Is that the case?
That continues to be the case. The U.S. knows that this is a matter which is, as China puts it, the core of all core interests. And if the U.S. were to support Taiwan independence or to prevent reunification, that crosses a red line, and it must eventually lead to war. At the same time, China cannot expect the U.S. to encourage Chinese reunification. So between not encouraging Chinese reunification and not supporting Taiwan independence, there is not a red line, but a red band. And the US wants to play on the red band. And they want China to draw the red line so they know exactly where they can play to discourage, not to prevent, but to discourage Chinese reunification. China knows the game, so China says, no, I'm not going to have a gut reel so that you can play this game. You play this game, there are dangers. As a result of which, there's tension. But I do not think in the short term the US will push too hard because they know that somewhere there, China has a red line. And in the short term at least, we won't know till after the next presidential elections what the US will look like. But for the next year and a half, 2 years, I don't think there will be a serious escalation of tension. Mm-hmm. But there should be rhetoric that the US will encourage its friends to poke China on the Taiwan issue. That is part of the tactical game being played. And I'm sure China is quite able to handle this game.
Yeah, probably that's the reason, people would say both sides, Beijing and Washington, they want to stabilize the relationship. And of course, since the balloon incident, it seems like we are seeing talks between officials from both sides, but we are not sure where they are going and how far they can go, to what extent that will help stabilize this relationship. And on the U.S. side, previously, the talk of decoupling, now they fine-tuned their policy a little bit, and probably in lockstep with their allies in Europe, they are also seeking the so-called de-risking from China. Will that somewhat alleviate this tension between the two countries?
It should. I read that Wang Yi met Jake Sullivan in Vienna over 2 days, many hours. I don't think they shared a meal together. And we all wonder, what were they talking about over so many hours? So there must be many things to talk about. And I don't think either side would have spent so much time if the discussions were not serious. And as I said earlier, it's very important that accidents don't happen around Taiwan or in the South China Sea, and which is why a dialogue between the two defense establishments is very important. This dialogue between Li Shangfu and Austin is very important, but it must be done on a proper basis. And the current basis is not acceptable to China. I can understand the reason for that. And I hope the US will understand it and create conditions where a proper dialogue can take place on the basis of equality, seriousness, and mutual respect.
You recently wrote that in the U.S. fear about China's rise is not that China will replace it as a global hegemon, but that China will help crystallize a multipolar world. Could you please elaborate more on that?
The U.S. is used to being very dominant in the world, in all fields, in intelligence gathering, in its military power, in its political influence, in its cultural influence, in its control of the financial system. So you now have China growing and becoming a new factor. And in the establishment, in the US establishment, they're not used to it and they don't like it. But I fear that if they were to prevent it from happening, they will still fail. But in the process, cause damage, not only to the world, but to themselves. I don't think the US can prevent the emergence of a multipolar world. The important question is, within the multipolar world, what is the neural configuration? I think the US and Europe will always be very close for civilizational reasons. And because it is the US through the Transatlantic Alliance, through NATO, which ensures the security of Europe. So within the multipolar world, the European pole and the American pole will be very close together. And the Russian pole and the China pole will be also close together. And India will be a pole on the side. But the question is, among the poles, who will be the first among equals? Primus inter pares. I think it will have to be the US. And the Europeans will want that. They will want the US to be the first among equals in the multipolar world. I think India wants that. I think China can accept it. China has no ambition to be the first among equals in a multipolar world. It may be the biggest, but he has no ambitions to be the first among equals. And neither will China be acceptable to the others. So if China, by its actions, by its words, by its policies, can envision a world in which we have a multipolar configuration, but without quite saying so, accepting the US as first among equals, we may well be able to transit into a global stable equilibrium.
How likely, we are going to see, say, a multipolar world in which, that will ensure peace and stability?
Well, China's peace proposal, which is really a statement of principles, but still valuable, was received with mixed feelings in the West. On the one hand, they do want peace, but peace on their terms, which they know they can't get. But at the same time, they're not happy that China is playing this role, because they also worry about China. So it's very important that China does not show too much enthusiasm in playing this role. China should say, look, this is a distant conflict. I'm not a party to it. Russia is my friend, but so is Ukraine. So is Europe, and I want the US to be my friend. And if there's a role I can play, of course I will play a role. If there's no role I can play, then I will not play a role. I will not intervene. I will not force myself. So it's a kind of a soft involvement. And like in Tai Chi, I think China should be very soft in making this move. Then there's a possibility of some good coming out of it. But if China plays it in a hard way, it will not lead to any good outcome. It will not be good for China. Mm-hmm. And it takes time.
Right. What do you mean by if China plays the hard way? I mean, China cannot force Russia to withdraw troops, or China cannot force like Ukraine to accept any peace terms if they are not willing to accept. And of course, now European countries, not the U.S., it's really up to the West and Russia, Ukraine, whether they can compromise or reach any kind of like a ceasefire or agreement or peace agreement. Ultimately, it's up to them, right?
Exactly. I think what you've just said is exactly the kind of approach China should take. It should not say, look, I think you should compromise here. It should be 50-50 there and 70-30 here. No, China should not talk like that. It should let the situation ripen according to its own nature. And if at an appropriate time it can play a role, then play that role, because no one else may be able to play it. Then China would have done something good for the world and for itself. Mm-hmm. But just by being available, it's already a plus.
On one side, you do see China continuing to grow its economy, its impact. And then on the other side, you do see probably there are challenges for the U.S., the only superpower, let's say, the first among the equals. Now you see more and more countries are choosing basically to avoid the U.S. dollars or reducing their dependence on U.S. dollars. What are the factors behind that choice? And I wonder how impactful that will be.
U.S. dominance in the world is enabled by the strength of the US dollar and the exorbitant privilege that it enjoys arising from the position of the US dollar. The US has 800 military bases around the world. Who is funding those bases? US taxpayers? Maybe some. The US can print money. And when the US prints money to finance military bases, in a sense, all of us in Singapore, in China, and Europe are being taxed to finance the security which the US provides. But the manner in which the US has been weaponizing the US dollar and the international financial system is causing many countries to feel aggrieved that, look, this is not reasonable. You are saying that your enemy, who's an old friend, must now be my enemy. And people resent it. Now, maybe they have to listen to the US because for the time being, they need the US. But in their minds, they will say, look, I will find an alternative. And one day, I will find my own way. And I'm surprised in the last few months. Every dinner I attend, every social gathering, people talk about de-dollarization. Now, this is not good for the US. But has the US changed policy? No. They continue to widen the sanction list. So this puzzles me because the very actions of the US is causing the de-dollarization momentum to increase. And I'm quite sure that among the big countries, China, Russia, and others, especially those in the BRICS countries, will want an alternative system, not to replace the current system, but to really tell the US, look, don't overplay this. Because if you do, we have an alternative. The alternative is not as good, but we will not be hostage to the current system.
Speak of the alternatives, of course, Saudi Arabia is reportedly to apply to join this BRICS Development Bank. And so you do see like major developing countries in the global south in particular, they are seeking to reduce their dependence on the US, somewhat distancing themselves from the US or from the US dollar. They are trying to establish or finding other alternatives for the safety probably of their own foreign assets or to avoid being sanctioned by Washington. Will this trend carry on, and then what kind of impact that will have probably on the I don't know, international order, so-called?
It's important to be clear that countries like Saudi Arabia do not want to turn against America because America is too important to them. What they want is to feel a greater sense of sovereignty and autonomy, that they can make their own decisions. That if they agree with the US, then the actions are aligned with the US. But there'll be areas where they may disagree and where the actions can diverge. The current system gives too much leverage to the US, which they do not want. So this alternative will, in a sense, make the system more honest because it breaks a monopoly and may lead to a better world. The US will eventually understand that it must respond to this threat. Initially, it says, no, the US cannot be replaced for decades because it is so dominant. So much of global trade is irreplaceable. Yes, maybe in the short term. But should you talk like that? Or should you say, look, I understand, and we will make adjustments. Now, if the US refuses to make adjustments, then it will accelerate the very outcome which it doesn't want.
But Washington's priority is to increase this debt ceiling, right?
No, the debt ceiling is just a tactical game between the political parties. I don't take it too seriously. I mean, they will find an agreement, and if they don't find an agreement and the government shut down for a few days, they will still find an agreement. It has no real economic consequence. The real economic development is that the US has been trying to tighten liquidity, but when it did, the financial system shook, so he had to loosen again. So he's got to calibrate. And this calibration is not easy. And in a presidential year, when all the concerns are domestic, they've got to manage this carefully, and which is one reason why they rather not have trouble with China, because it may create more complications for their domestic politics.
More complications. Now, take a look at the future. I mean, it's difficult to predict, but anyway, with the multipolar world, so do you think, let's say if there are serious high-level dialogues between China and the U.S., are they going to talk about issues beyond their relationship, about this future framework, a future order of the international community? For example, as you mentioned, about one country, first of equals, and then we can all accept a new global order?
I think the problem is deeper. The problem is that the U.S., many people in the U.S. believes that China will become an imperial power. The E2 will seek to dominate the areas where it has the greatest influence and behave the way the Western powers and Japan did in the past. China has a different nature. China likes its homogeneity. I don't think the Chinese people want Beijing and Shanghai to be like New York and London or Paris. A few foreigners here and there, that's okay. But to have this great mixing of population, of religions, of values, it will make China very difficult to govern. So China by itself is an insular power. And it's never believed that there's any profit in interfering in other people's affairs. I mean, for the Chinese government, governing China is so difficult. How could China have any desire to interfere in the governance of other countries? So its approach is, I have my own problems in my family, you have yours, good luck to you. I can't tell you what to do, but I wish you all the best. If I can help you, tell me what I can do, and if I can help you, I will help you. But I will never tell you how you should handle your family problems. And China does not believe that anybody else can tell China how to solve its own problems. I think only the Chinese people can find the way forward to the future of the Chinese people.
Yes, the Chinese culture and the tradition playing a very important role into this governance. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to Mr. Yang. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.